Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host for today's mystery. When a shipbuilder is found shot dead on a foggy pier, everyone thinks it's spies. But stay till the end to discover how worthless plans and hidden secrets reveal a murder born from desperation and shame. Before we begin, write a comment and tell me which corner of the world you're listening from today. Settle in with a hot cup of tea, and let's follow Superintendent Battle as he unravels this mystery. The fog that had blanketed the coastal town of Alderwick through the night was lifting with the reluctance of an old dog roused from sleep. Wisps of gray mist still clung to the weathered planks of the pier as Police Constable Hennings made his routine morning patrol, his heavy boots echoing hollowly in the damp November air. It was 7:20 when he saw the figure lying motionless near the Yahweh Pier's end, where the structure jutted boldly into the gray waters of the channel. At first glance, Hennings thought it might be some unfortunate soul who had taken too much drink the night before. Such discoveries were not unknown in a poor town like Alderwick. But as he approached, quickening his pace despite himself, the constable's trained eye noted details that made his stomach tighten with foreboding. The man lay on his back, arms spread wide, staring sightlessly at the clearing sky. His expensive overcoat was soaked through, not from the fog alone, but from the dark stain that had spread across his chest. Even in the uncertain morning light, Hennings could see that Edmund Castair, owner of the town's most prominent shipyard, would never again stride purposefully down the pier to inspect his vessels. Hennings knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. The bullet wound was clearly visible now, a small, neat hole in the left side of Castair's chest that had undoubtedly found its mark in the heart. The constable's gaze swept the immediate area, searching for anything that might provide a clue to the killer's identity. The receding tide had done its thorough work, however, washing the pier clean of footprints or any other evidence that might have told the story of Castair's final moments. The telephone call to Inspector Morrison at the county police headquarters was brief and to the point. Within minutes, the machinery of investigation had been set in motion, and by nightfall the pier had been cordoned off with rope, and a small crowd of curious townspeople had gathered at a respectful distance. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the mixture of shock and ghoulish fascination that murder inevitably brings to quiet communities. It was 10:10 when Superintendent Battle arrived from London, summoned by Morrison, who had recognized immediately that the death of Edmund Castair might involve matters beyond the scope of local crime. Battle stepped from the train at Alderwick Station with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned that patience was often more valuable than speed in criminal investigation. He was a large man, unremarkable in appearance, with the sort of face that people found difficult to remember precisely. His gray suit was well made but not ostentatious, and his manner carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years observing human nature at its worst and best. Inspector Morrison, a thin, nervous man with prematurely gray hair, met him at the station with visible relief. "Glad you could come so quickly, Superintendent," Morrison said as they walked toward the pier. "This business has the whole town in an uproar. Castair was not just the largest employer hereabouts. He held several government contracts for naval construction." Battle nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. He had learned long ago that initial impressions, however well-intentioned, could color an investigation in unhelpful ways. Better to see the scene with fresh eyes and form his own conclusions. The pier stretched out before them like an accusing finger pointed at the gray horizon. Battle walked its length slowly, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the weathered planking, the iron bollards where ships tied up, the occasional coil of rope or discarded fishing net. When he reached the spot where Castair's body had been found, now marked only by a chalk outline, he stopped and stood quite still for several minutes. "The tide turned at approximately 4 this morning," he said finally. "High water mark would have been about here." He indicated a line of seaweed and debris some 10 feet from where the body had lain. Yet our Mr. Castair was found well clear of the water's reach. Meaning? Morrison asked. Meaning he was shot sometime after the tide began to ebb, or his body was moved after death. Battle knelt where the chalk marks indicated Caster's head had been. P.C. Hennings mentioned a missing briefcase in his report. Has anyone from the shipyard confirmed what Caster might have been carrying? His secretary, Miss Apprentice, said he often took work home in a brown leather briefcase. She's quite certain he had it with him when he left the office yesterday. Evening. Battle rose and dusted off his knees, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His gaze swept over the growing crowd of onlookers, noting faces, studying expressions, filing away impressions that might prove useful later. Among the assembled townspeople, he recognized the sharp features and expensive clothing of a woman, who could only be Mrs. Caster, standing slightly apart from the others with the dignity of the recently bereaved. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing Alderwick in all its modest seaside charm. The town clustered around the harbor like a collection of weathered toys, its narrow streets climbing the gentle slope away from the water. But beneath the picturesque surface, Superintendent Battle sensed the currents of suspicion and fear that murder always brings to small communities, where everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. The investigation was just beginning, and already Battle could feel the familiar weight of secrets pressing against the surface of apparent respectability. The Caster residence stood on the hill overlooking Alderwick Harbor. Its Georgian facade presented the same composed dignity that characterized its mistress. Superintendent Battle approached the house through iron gates that had been left discreetly open, noting the well-maintained gardens and the subtle signs of prosperity that spoke of careful management rather than ostentatious display. Mrs. Helena Caster received him in the morning room, a pleasant chamber with tall windows that offered a commanding view of the pier where her husband's body had been discovered. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair arranged with understated elegance, and dark eyes that revealed little of her inner thoughts. Her black dress was simple but well cut, and she wore no jewelry save for her wedding ring and a small pearl brooch at her throat. "Superintendent Battle," she said, rising to greet him with a composure that spoke of breeding and long practice in maintaining appearances. "Inspector Morrison told me you would be calling. Please do sit down." Battle settled himself in the indicated chair, his observant gaze taking in the room's furnishings. Family photographs stood on the mantelpiece, formal portraits that included a younger Helena, Edmund Caster in his prime, and a fair-haired young man who could only be the stepson mentioned in Morrison's briefing. "I realize this is a difficult time, Mrs. Caster," Battle began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well in countless interviews. "I shall try to be as brief as possible, but I'm afraid I must ask some questions about your husband's recent activities." "Of course." Helena Caster folded her hands in her lap with careful precision. Edmund was devoted to his work. The shipyard meant everything to him. It was his father's legacy, you understand, and he felt the weight of that responsibility keenly. Had he seemed troubled recently? Worried about anything in particular? A slight hesitation, barely perceptible, crossed her features before she replied. "The war preparations have placed enormous demands on all our shipbuilders. Edmund worked long hours, often bringing papers home to study in the evenings. The government contracts require such attention to detail." Battle made a mental note of the careful phrasing. "The missing briefcase, would you have any idea what it might have contained?" "Technical drawings, most likely. Specifications for the naval vessels we're constructing. Edmund was always very particular about security where government work was concerned." The sound of footsteps in the hall preceded the appearance of a young man of perhaps 22, tall and fair, with the kind of classical features that suggested privilege and education. His entrance carried a nervous energy that contrasted sharply with his stepmother's controlled demeanor. "Mother?" I heard voices. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Battle, his face flushing slightly. "I beg your pardon, I didn't realize we had a visitor." "This is Superintendent Battle from London," Helena said with careful formality. "David, my stepson, David Castair." Battle rose to shake hands, noting the young man's firm grip and the slight tremor that spoke of strain carefully controlled. "Mr. Castair, I was sorry to hear about your father." "Thank you." David's voice carried the educated accents of Cambridge, but there was an underlying tension that suggested recent stress. "It's all rather shocking, really. One simply doesn't expect this sort of thing to happen in Alderwick." "Had your father mentioned any concerns about the business recently?" Battle asked, resuming his seat and watching both stepmother and son carefully. David glanced quickly at Helena before answering. "Well, naturally there's been pressure with the war contracts. Father was working harder than usual, I'd say. But the yard has never been busier. Surely that's a good thing." "Indeed." Battle allowed a comfortable silence to develop, one of his most effective investigative techniques. People, he had learned, were uncomfortable with silence and often filled it with revelations they had not intended to make. It was Helena who spoke first. "The business has always had its challenges. Edmund built it up from what his father left, but competition has been fierce in recent years. These government contracts have been a blessing, really. Your husband's partner, Mr. Brennan, how long had they been associated?" "Thomas has been with the firm for nearly 10 years, Helena replied. "He manages much of the day-to-day operations, while Edmund focused on the technical aspects and client relations." Battle sensed undercurrents in the carefully neutral response. "And their partnership was harmonious?" Another slight hesitation. "As harmonious as any business relationship, I suppose. They had different approaches to certain matters, but that's not uncommon between partners." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Brennan has always been rather cautious in his outlook. Father was more willing to take calculated risks for the sake of growth." The comment drew a sharp glance from Helena, quickly suppressed, but not before Battle had observed it. The family dynamics were clearly more complex than the surface suggested, with tensions that went beyond simple grief over the patriarch's death. "I understand you've recently returned from university, Mr. Castair," Battle said, turning his attention to the young man. "What are your plans now?" "I'd intended to join the firm, naturally. Father was keen for me to learn the business from the ground up." David's voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested those plans might now be in question. Battle spent another quarter hour with gentle questions that revealed little new information, but confirmed his growing impression that the Castair household harbored secrets beneath its facade of respectable mourning. When he finally took his leave, both Helena and David accompanied him to the door with the courtesy of people eager to see their visitor depart. Walking back down the hill toward the town center, Battle reflected on the interview. The widow's composure was admirable, but perhaps too perfect. The stepson's nervousness suggested guilt about something, though whether connected to his father's death remained to be determined. The missing briefcase had clearly contained something of importance, but Battle was beginning to suspect that its significance might not be what it initially appeared. The afternoon sun had broken through the morning's gray clouds, casting sharp shadows across Alderwick's narrow streets, as Battle made his way toward his next appointment, with Thomas Brennan. The town seemed peaceful enough in the clear light, but murder had a way of revealing the darker currents that flowed beneath the surface of even the most respectable communities. Chapter 3. Shadows from Abroad. The offices of Castair's shipbuilding occupied a sturdy brick building on Harbor Street, its windows overlooking the busy yard where the skeletal frames of 2 naval vessels rose like the ribs of sleeping giants. Superintendent Battle found Thomas Brennan in the main office, surrounded by ledgers and blueprints, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the November chill that penetrated the building's walls. Brennan was a compact man in his early 50s, with thinning dark hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years spent in practical work before ascending to management. His greeting was cordial enough, but Battle detected an underlying nervousness in the way his fingers drummed against his desk, and his eyes avoided direct contact. "Terrible business, this," Brennan said, gesturing for Battle to take the chair opposite his desk. "Edmund was not just my partner. He was a good friend. 20 years we'd known each other, and I still can't believe he's gone." "I understand the firm has been particularly busy recently," Battle observed, his gaze taking in the organized chaos of papers that covered every available surface. "Oh yes, busier than we've ever been. These Admiralty contracts, they're a godsend, really. The Yard was struggling before the war preparations began." Brennan's voice carried genuine enthusiasm, but his hands continued their restless movement. "Edmund was brilliant with the technical side, you understand? He could look at a set of specifications and see immediately how to improve the design. The financial side of the business?" A slight pause, barely perceptible but noted by Battle's experienced eye. "Well, that's more my department. Edmund preferred to leave such matters to me while he focused on engineering and client relations." Battle nodded thoughtfully. "The missing briefcase. Would you have any idea what your partner might have been carrying?" "Could have been any number of things. We've got 3 major projects running simultaneously, all with their own sets of plans and modifications." Brennan finally met Battle's gaze directly. "The Admiralty is very particular about security, as you might imagine. All sensitive documents are supposed to be kept in the office safe, but Edmund sometimes took work home when deadlines were pressing." The sound of raised voices from the yard below drew Battle's attention to the window. A group of workers had gathered around a tall, fair-haired man who was gesturing animatedly while pointing toward the harbor. The man's accent, clearly audible even through the glass, carried the distinctive cadences of educated German. "Dr. Weber," Brennan said, following Battle's gaze, "comes around quite regularly. He does some sort of scientific research about coastal erosion." "Indeed," Battle's interest sharpened. "How long has he been conducting this research?" "Oh, must be nearly 2 years now." "Harmless. Enough fellow, I suppose, though some of the locals are a bit suspicious of foreigners these days. Can't say I blame them, considering the circumstances." Battle made his excuses and descended to the yard, where he found Dr. Friedrich Weber examining the foundation stones of the pier with scholarly attention. Weber was a man of perhaps 40, tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time with books rather than outdoor pursuits. His English was excellent, though marked by a slight accent that betrayed his origins. "Dr. Weber, I am Superintendent Battle, investigating the death of Mr. Castere. I wonder if I might have a word." Weber straightened, his intelligent blue eyes showing a flicker of apprehension. "Of course, Superintendent, though I fear I can be of little assistance. I barely knew the gentleman personally." "But you were familiar with his movements around the harbor?" "In a general sense, yes. My research requires detailed observation of tidal patterns and their effect on coastal structures. The pier where Mr. Castere was found is particularly interesting from a geological perspective." Battle allowed his gaze to wander over Weber's equipment, notebooks, measuring instruments, and a camera of professional quality. "You work alone in this research?" "Entirely alone. The University of Heidelberg provided funding for a comprehensive study of English coastal erosion patterns. It is work that requires patience and long periods of observation, including nighttime." Observation. A barely perceptible stiffening of Weber's posture. Tidal movements do not confine themselves to daylight hours. Superintendent, some of the most significant changes occurred during the hours of darkness. Battle's next appointment was with Captain James Morrison, not to be confused with Inspector Morrison, a retired naval officer who had made his concerns about foreign observers well known to anyone who would listen. Battle found him at the Anchor Inn. holding court with several local men over pints of bitter and dire predictions about the war to come. Captain Morrison was a florid man of 60-odd years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the voice to match. His mustache bristled with indignation as he outlined his suspicions about Dr. Weber's nocturnal activities. "Mark my words, Superintendent, that German fellow is up to no good. Scientific research, my eye. I've seen him skulking about the harbor at all hours, taking photographs and making notes. What sort of coastal erosion requires that kind of documentation? Have you observed him near the Castair shipyard specifically?" "Numerous occasions. Always claimed to be studying the pier foundations. But I've watched him through my field glasses. He pays far more attention to the ships under construction than to any geological formations." Battle absorbed this information, with his characteristic reserve, neither encouraging the captain's suspicions nor dismissing them entirely. The interview revealed that Weber had indeed been seen near the shipyard on the evening of Castair's death, though Captain Morrison's tendency toward dramatic interpretation made his testimony suspect. As evening approached, Battle walked the harbor front alone, piecing together the day's revelations. The investigation was developing along lines that suggested possibilities far beyond simple murder for robbery. If Dr. Weber was indeed engaged in espionage, the missing briefcase might contain exactly the sort of naval secrets that would interest German intelligence. Yet something about the neat progression of suspicious circumstances troubled Battle's experienced instincts. The fog was beginning to roll in from the channel again, blurring the boundaries between sea and sky, between certainty and speculation. In cases involving potential espionage, Battle had learned that the obvious explanation was often a convenient distraction from more mundane, but equally compelling motives. As he stood where Edmund Castair had drawn his last breath, Battle found himself wondering whether the secrets that had died with the shipbuilder were political, or merely personal. The investigation was entering deeper waters, and Battle sensed that the morning's clarity would give way to murkier depths before the truth finally surfaced. The second day of the investigation dawned gray and still, with the kind of oppressive quiet that often follows violent death in small communities. Superintendent Battle had spent the evening in careful thought at his modest lodgings above the post office, reviewing his notes and considering the various threads that were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern of considerable complexity. His morning began with a return to the Castair residence, this time armed with a search warrant that Inspector Morrison had reluctantly but necessarily obtained. Helena Castair received the news with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout, though Battle noted the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this intrusion into her private domain was more unwelcome than she cared to admit. "I understand the necessity, Superintendent," she said, leading him through the well-appointed rooms, "though I cannot imagine what you expect to find that might shed light on Edmund's death." Battle's methodical search of the house revealed little of immediate interest, until he reached Helena's private sitting room, a feminine retreat decorated in soft blues and grays, with watercolor landscapes adorning the walls. The delicate writing desk by the window had been locked. When Helena produced the key with obvious reluctance, Battle understood that he was approaching something she had hoped to keep private. The desk's compartments yielded the usual domestic correspondence: bills, social invitations, letters from distant relatives. But it was the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon in the deepest drawer that caused Battle to pause. The handwriting on the envelopes was decidedly masculine, the return address indicating a London hotel, and the most recent postmark was dated only 3 weeks prior to Edmund Castair's death. "I think, Mrs. Castair, we should discuss these in private," Battle said quietly, his tone carrying both authority and compassion. Helena's composure finally cracked, though only slightly. "Those are personal letters, Superintendent. They have nothing whatever to do with Edmund's death." "Perhaps not, but I'm afraid I must be the judge of that." In the morning room where they had first met, Battle examined the letters, while Helena sat in rigid silence, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the skin. The correspondence told a story that was both touching and troubling. Passionate letters from one Major Charles Ashford, writing from various London addresses over the past 6 months. The letters spoke of a love that had survived 20 years of separation, a man presumed dead in the trenches of France, who had lived through wounds that left him scarred both physically and emotionally. They revealed clandestine meetings in London, carefully planned encounters that had rekindled a romance from Helena's youth before her marriage to Edmund Castair. Major Ashford was reported killed at Passchendaele. Helena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I mourned him for 20 years, Superintendent. When he contacted me last spring claiming to have survived but been too damaged to return to his old life, I thought at first it must be some cruel hoax. But you met with him 3 times in London? I told Edmund I was visiting my sister. The admission seemed to cost her considerable effort. Charles had been badly wounded, spent years in a sanatorium, lost his memory for a time. When he finally recovered enough to attempt contact with his old life, he discovered that everyone believed him dead. It seemed easier to remain so. Battle studied the letters carefully, noting references to meetings and plans that suggested the relationship had moved beyond mere nostalgic reminiscence. Did your husband know of Major Ashford's survival? Helena's silence was answer enough. But when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of long-suppressed guilt. Edmund suspected something. He had become increasingly withdrawn in recent weeks, asking questions about my trips to London, watching me in a way he never had before. The investigation took on new dimensions when Battle turned his attention to David Castair's financial situation. A discreet inquiry at the young man's bank revealed debts that far exceeded what might be expected from normal university expenses. The manager, a discreet gentleman of the old school, was reluctant to discuss specifics, but confirmed that David's account had been significantly overdrawn for several months. A telephone call to Cambridge provided additional disturbing details. David Castair had been involved in a gambling circle that included several young men of similar background and limited financial sense. His losses at cards and on various sporting events had mounted steadily throughout his final year, culminating in debts that would have been impossible to meet from his allowance alone. Young gentlemen sometimes develop expensive habits, the college dean explained with the weary tone of someone who had seen such problems before. Mr. Castair was not unique in that regard, though his situation had become rather more serious than most. When Battle returned to interview David that afternoon, he found the young man in the shipyard office, attempting to make sense of technical drawings that were clearly beyond his understanding. The contrast between his privileged education and practical ignorance was stark, and Battle sensed the desperation of someone suddenly forced to confront realities he had never considered. Your father was planning to bring you into the business, Battle observed, settling into the chair that had so recently been occupied by the murdered man. Yes, though I'm beginning to realize how little I actually know about shipbuilding. David's laugh carried no humor. Father always said there would be time enough to learn the practical side after I finished my studies. And your financial obligations in Cambridge? Were you planning to discuss those with your father? The question hit its mark with devastating accuracy. David's face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he set down the blueprints he had been pretending to study. I don't know what you mean, he said, but the words lacked conviction. I think you do, Mr. Castair. Gambling debts of several £100s are not easily concealed, particularly when creditors become impatient. The young man's composure crumbled entirely. Father would have been furious. He had very strong views about gambling, about honor and responsibility. I kept thinking I could win it back, that one good night would solve everything. Battle felt the familiar satisfaction of watching pieces fall into place, though he was careful not to let his expression reveal his thoughts. The Castair family was proving to harbor secrets that went far beyond the surface tragedy of Edmund's death, and each revelation opened new possibilities for both motive and opportunity. As he left the shipyard in the gathering dusk, Battle reflected on the human capacity for self-deception and the dangerous lengths to which ordinary people would go to protect their carefully constructed facades. The fog was rolling in again from the channel, obscuring the boundaries between truth and illusion, just as effectively as it concealed the movements of those who preferred to conduct their business in darkness. The third morning of the investigation brought with it a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very bones of Alderwick, turning the cobblestones slick and giving the harbor a melancholy aspect that matched Superintendent Battle's increasingly somber mood. His patient methodology was beginning to reveal truths that cast the victim's death in an entirely different light from the espionage drama that had initially seemed so compelling. Battle's appointment with Thomas Brennan had been arranged for early morning, before the shipyard workers arrived. He found Castair's partner in the company office, but this time the man's nervous energy had given way to something approaching despair. The ledgers that had been neatly organized during their first meeting now lay scattered across the desk, and Brennan's appearance suggested a man who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with problems that would not be solved by morning. "I suppose there's no point in pretending any longer," Brennan said without preamble as Battle entered. "You'll discover the truth soon enough through your inquiries." Battle settled himself in the familiar chair, noting how the morning light revealed lines of strain in Brennan's face that had not been apparent during their previous interview. "What truth would that be, Mr. Brennan?" "The company was finished, Superintendent. These government contracts you've heard so much about, they weren't the salvation everyone believed them to be." Brennan's voice carried the flat tone of a man confessing to failures he could no longer conceal. The specifications were so demanding, the deadline so tight, that we were losing money on every vessel we built. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Battle had encountered financial desperation before, and he knew how it could drive otherwise honest men to actions they would never have contemplated in better circumstances. How long had the company been in difficulties? Nearly 18 months. We'd been covering our losses by borrowing against future contracts, but the creditors were becoming restless. Edmund kept insisting we could find a way through, that his technical innovations would eventually prove profitable. Brennan laughed bitterly. He was a brilliant engineer, but he never understood that brilliance alone doesn't pay wages or satisfy bank managers. Battle made careful notes while Brennan continued his confession. The picture that emerged was of a partnership under tremendous strain, with the two men disagreeing fundamentally about how to address their mounting problems. Edmund Castair had apparently been convinced that the missing briefcase contained designs revolutionary enough to secure additional government funding, while H.R. Brennan had feared that their true financial situation would inevitably be discovered. The briefcase, Battle said carefully. What exactly did it contain? Brennan's hesitation was profound, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man admitting to his deepest failure. Plans that Edmund believed were revolutionary, modifications to hull design that he claimed would give British naval vessels unprecedented speed and maneuverability. But you had doubts about their value. More than doubts, Superintendent. I had the designs independently evaluated by a naval engineer of my acquaintance. His assessment was discouraging. The modifications were based on sound theory, but they incorporated principles that had been tried and abandoned during the previous war. Any German intelligence officer with access to proper technical records would have recognized them immediately as worthless. The revelation struck Battle with the force of a physical blow. If the contents of the missing briefcase were indeed worthless, then the entire espionage theory that had driven much of his investigation became suddenly questionable. The implications rippled outward like stones thrown into a still pond, disturbing assumptions and revealing new possibilities. His afternoon interview with Dr. Weber took place at the scientist's lodgings above the village chemist's shop, a modest set of rooms that reflected both scholarly dedication and straitened circumstances. Weber received him with the courtesy of a man who had nothing to hide, though Battle detected an underlying weariness that suggested the German was well aware of the suspicions his presence had aroused. "I've been expecting this conversation, Superintendent," Weber said, gesturing toward a small sitting room, lined with geological texts and scientific journals. "Captain Morrison has made his feelings about my research quite clear to anyone who will listen." Battle examined the room carefully, noting the meticulous organization of Weber's notes and the obvious genuineness of his scientific equipment. "Your research has required extensive observation of the harbor area." Indeed, the interaction between tidal forces and man-made structures provides fascinating insights into coastal erosion patterns. Castairs Pier in particular shows stress patterns that may be replicated along similar stretches of the English coast, including observations made during nighttime hours. Weber's smile carried genuine amusement. "I fear Captain Morrison's military background has led him to see conspiracy where only dedication exists. Tidal movements are most dramatic during the hours of darkness, when human activity does not interfere with natural processes." Battle found himself increasingly convinced of the scientist's legitimacy, though he noted that Weber's nocturnal wanderings had indeed taken him near the scene of the murder on the night in question. The German's account of his movements was detailed and credible, supported by extensive notes and photographic evidence that demonstrated the scholarly nature of his work. The final revelation of the day came from an unexpected source. Miss Apprentice, Edmund Castair's secretary, requested a private meeting that she insisted must take place away from the shipyard office. Battle met her at a small tea shop in the older part of town, where her nervous manner and frequent glances toward the door suggested she feared being observed. "There's something you should know about Mr. Castair, Superintendent," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Something that might explain what happened that night." Miss Apprentice was a spinster of middle years, with the precise manner of someone who had spent decades managing other people's affairs with quiet efficiency. Her revelation concerned a telephone conversation she had overheard 3 days before. The murder. A heated exchange in which Edmund Castair had accused someone of betrayal and threatened to expose their deception. He was furious, Superintendent. I'd never heard him speak with such anger. He kept saying that reputations built on lies would not survive the truth, and that he would not be made complicit in fraud. The implications of this overheard conversation cast everything Battle had learned in a new and troubling light. He walked back through Alderwick's narrow streets in the gathering dusk. He found himself confronting the possibility that Edmund Castair had died, not because of what he knew about naval secrets, but because of what he had discovered about far more personal deceptions. The fog was beginning to roll in from the channel once again, but this time Battle welcomed its concealing embrace. Sometimes the truth emerged more clearly when the obvious explanations were stripped away, leaving only the stark outlines of human motivation and the terrible prices people would pay to protect the lies on which they had built their lives. The fourth day dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind from the channel that cut through the November air like a blade. Superintendent Battle had spent much of the previous evening in quiet contemplation, allowing the various threads of evidence to weave themselves into patterns that his experienced mind could finally begin to recognize. The truth, when it came, often arrived not with dramatic revelation, but with the quiet certainty of pieces falling into their inevitable places. His morning began with a telephone call to the Admiralty, a conversation that confirmed his growing suspicions about the true nature of the missing briefcase's contents. The official who spoke with him was discreetly helpful, providing information that cast Edmund Castair's revolutionary designs in an entirely different light from what the murdered man had believed. "The specifications you describe were indeed submitted for evaluation last month," the naval officer explained, with the careful precision of someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive matters. Our technical assessment concluded that while the theoretical principles were sound, the practical applications had been thoroughly explored between 1916 and 1918. The modifications would provide no meaningful advantage to modern naval construction. Battle absorbed this confirmation with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts had proven correct. The briefcase that had disappeared with Edmund Castair contained not state secrets that might interest foreign agents, but obsolete designs that would have exposed their creator's tragic misunderstanding of his own work's value. His subsequent interview with Major Charles Ashford took place in the lobby of a modest London hotel, where the man Helena Castair had believed dead for 20 years proved to be very much alive, though bearing the visible scars of wounds that had indeed nearly claimed his life. Ashford was a thin, prematurely aged man whose left hand showed the tremor of old nerve damage, and whose eyes held the haunted quality common to those who had seen too much of war's brutality. "I never intended for Helena to become involved in deception," Ashford said, his voice carrying the cultured accents of the officer class, tempered by years of suffering. "When I finally recovered enough to attempt contact with my former life, I discovered that my family had long since accepted my death. It seemed kinder to let them continue believing it." "But you contacted Mrs. Castair." "Helena was different. We had been close before the war. When I learned of her marriage, I thought it best to remain dead to her as well. But loneliness is a terrible thing, Superintendent. And when I finally wrote to her, she responded with such joy that I convinced myself no harm could come of a few meetings." Battle studied the man carefully, noting the obvious sincerity of his regret and the genuine affection that colored his references to Helena. "Did you know that Mr. Castair had become suspicious of his wife's activities?" Ashford's face grew pale. "Helena mentioned that Edmund had been asking questions about her trips to London. We had agreed that our last meeting would be exactly that, a final farewell before I disappeared from her life once more." The picture that emerged from this conversation was of two people caught between genuine feeling and the impossibility of their situation, neither fully understanding how their secret had contributed to the growing pressures that had consumed Edmund Castair in his final days. Battle's return to Alderwick brought him face to face with the final piece of the puzzle in a way that demonstrated once again how patient observation could reveal truths that dramatic confrontation might never uncover. He found Thomas Brennan in the shipyard office, staring out at the harbor with the hollow expression of a man who had realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. "You've discovered the truth about the naval contracts," Brennan said without turning from the window. It was not a question. "Among other things, yes." Battle settled into the chair he had occupied during their previous interviews, his manner calm and unthreatening despite the gravity of the moment. The company was not just struggling financially. It was built on a foundation that was about to crumble. Brennan finally turned, and Battle saw in his face the terrible exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an unbearable burden for too long. Edmund refused to accept reality. He was convinced that his designs would revolutionize naval construction, that fame and fortune were just one breakthrough away. When I tried to explain that we were building our hopes on outdated principles, he accused me of lacking vision. "So you had the designs independently evaluated, without his knowledge?" "Yes." The assessment was devastating. Not just wrong, but embarrassingly obsolete. If the Admiralty had discovered the truth, we would have faced charges of fraud, as well as bankruptcy. Brennan's voice carried the flat despair of complete defeat. I tried to convince Edmund to withdraw the proposal quietly, to claim we needed more time for development. But he was determined to present his plans personally to the Naval Committee. Battle could see the final moments of Edmund Castair's life taking shape with terrible clarity. He was carrying the designs to a meeting that night, not to a meeting, Superintendent, to destroy them. I had finally convinced him that presentation would mean ruin for us both, that his reputation and mine would be destroyed when the truth came out. Brennan's hands trembled as he continued. We arranged to meet on the pier at midnight, away from curious eyes. I was to help him burn the documents and devise some explanation for the Admiralty about why we needed to postpone our presentation. The confession that followed came with the slow inevitability of water finding its level. Brennan described how the meeting had begun calmly enough, with both men agreeing that the designs must be destroyed. But Edmund Castere, finally confronted with the magnitude of his failure, had suddenly refused to proceed. His pride, wounded by years of struggle and recent discoveries about his wife's deception, had rebelled against this final admission of defeat. He said he would rather face the consequences than live with the knowledge that his life's work was worthless. Brennan concluded. He threatened to present the plans regardless, to let the experts judge their merit publicly. I tried to reason with him, but he had moved beyond rational discussion. The gun, Brennan explained, had been in my coat pocket, a precaution against the footpads who sometimes preyed on solitary walkers in the harbor district. In the struggle that followed Edmund's announcement of his intentions, the weapon discharged almost accidentally, though my description suggests the desperation guided my hand as much as chance. As Battle listened to this final revelation, he felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that accompanied the resolution of a case built on human weakness rather than criminal calculation. The fog was beginning to roll in from the channel once more, but this time it seemed less like concealment than like a merciful veil drawn over the exposure of private shame and public failure. The arrest of Thomas Brennan took place without fanfare in the quiet of the shipyard office, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the harbor where Edmund Castere had met his death. Superintendent Battle had learned long ago that the moment of apprehension often revealed more about a criminal's true character than hours of interrogation. And Brennan's response to the inevitable confirmed Battle's assessment of a man driven to violence by desperation rather than malice. I suppose I've been expecting this, Brennan said quietly, making no attempt to flee or protest his innocence. The weight of it has been unbearable, Superintendent. I've barely slept since that night. Battle observed the man with the professional detachment that years of experience had taught him, noting how Brennan's confession had seemed to drain him of the nervous energy that had characterized their earlier meetings. There was relief in his manner now, the terrible relief of a burden finally shared. You want to make a formal statement? Battle said, his tone carrying neither triumph nor condemnation. Inspector Morrison will need to hear the full account. The formal proceedings that followed unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all of Battle's cases. Brennan's statement, given in the presence of a solicitor hastily summoned from the county town, provided a complete account of the events leading to Edmund Castere's death. The picture that emerged was not of premeditated murder, but of a tragedy born from the collision of pride, desperation, and the terrible human capacity for self-deception. Helena Castere received the news of Brennan's arrest with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the investigation, though Battle detected a profound sadness in her dark eyes that spoke of more than simple grief for her husband's death. She had lost not only Edmund, but also the carefully constructed life they had built together, and the future that now stretched before her, uncertain and changed. I cannot help but feel responsible, she said, as Battle prepared to take his leave from the house on the hill. If Edmund had not learned about Charles, if he had not been tormented by doubts about my faithfulness, perhaps he might have accepted Mr. Brennan's counsel more readily. You cannot know that, Mrs. Castere, Battle replied gently. Your husband's pride was wounded by the discovery that his life's work was built on false premises. That knowledge would have been devastating regardless of any other circumstances, David. Castere proved more resilient than Battle had initially expected, facing the twin revelations of his father's murder and the company's bankruptcy with a maturity that suggested the events had forced him to grow beyond his years. The young man's gambling debts, while serious, were not insurmountable. Battle sensed that the shock of recent events had cured him of whatever romantic notions he might have harbored about games of chance. "I shall have to find proper employment," David said, with the sober acceptance of someone whose comfortable assumptions about the future had been permanently shattered. Father always said that honest work was the foundation of character. I suppose I'm about to discover whether he was correct. Dr. Weber's vindication came through Battle's final report, which clearly established the German scientist's innocence of any involvement in espionage or murder. The man's nocturnal observations of tidal patterns had indeed placed him near the scene of the crime, but his detailed notes and photographs provided an alibi that was both comprehensive and completely credible. "I am grateful for your thoroughness, Superintendent," Weber said, when Battle informed him that he was free to continue his research without interference. Captain Morrison's suspicions were understandable, given the current international situation, but they made my work considerably more difficult. Captain Morrison himself proved gracious in his acceptance of Weber's innocence, though Battle suspected the retired naval officer would find other targets for his patriotic vigilance before long. The captain's suspicions had been genuine, if misguided, and Battle recognized in him the type of man whose instincts were often valuable, even when his conclusions proved incorrect. The resolution of the case brought with it the usual mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that Battle had learned to associate with successful investigations. Justice had been served, but at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the tragedy. The Castair shipyard would likely close, putting dozens of men out of work at a time when employment was already scarce. Helena Castair faced an uncertain future, her reputation inevitably damaged by the revelations about her secret correspondence with Major Ashford. As Battle prepared to return to London, he reflected on the human capacity for creating elaborate structures of deception that ultimately collapsed under their own weight. Edmund Castair had built his final hopes on designs he believed revolutionary, while Thomas Brennan had constructed a partnership on the false premise that their financial problems could be solved through technical innovation. Both men had fallen victim to the dangerous gap between aspiration and reality. The fog that had characterized much of Battle's stay in Alderwick was absent on his final morning in the town, replaced by clear autumn air that revealed the harbor in sharp detail. The pier where Edmund Castair had died stretched out into waters that sparkled with reflected sunlight, giving no hint of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Battle knew from experience that time would eventually heal the wounds left by violent death, but the scars would remain visible to those who understood where to look for them. Standing at the railway station with his modest suitcase, Battle allowed himself a final glance at the town that had occupied his attention for the past week. Alderwick would survive this tragedy, as it had survived others, its essential character unchanged by the temporary disruption of murder and investigation. The human drama that had played out against its picturesque backdrop was concluded. But Battle knew that somewhere else, other secrets were building pressure behind other facades of respectability, awaiting their own moment of inevitable revelation. 6. Months had passed since Superintendent Battle last walked the pier at Alderwick, and the spring morning that brought him back to the coastal town seemed to promise renewal and peace. The harsh winds of winter had given way to gentle breezes that carried the scent of salt and blooming hawthorn, and the harbor sparkled under a sky that held more blue than gray for the first time in Battle's memory of the place. He had not come on official business this time, but rather to satisfy a curiosity that occasionally drew him back to scenes of past investigations. There was something to be learned, he had found, from observing how communities recovered from the disruptions that violent crime invariably brought, and Alderwick had presented a case complex enough to warrant such reflection. The town itself showed few outward signs of the tragedy that had unfolded the previous November. The shops along Harbor Street conducted their business with the same unhurried efficiency. Fishermen mended their nets with the same patient skill, and visitors strolled the waterfront with the same appreciation for seaside charm that had drawn them before Edmund Castere met his death on the pier. Yet Battle's experienced eye could detect the subtle changes that marked a community's passage through crisis. The Castere shipyard stood empty now, its gates secured with heavy chains and its windows reflecting nothing but sky. The naval contracts had been transferred to a larger firm in Portsmouth, and the skilled workers who had once given the place its purpose had scattered to find employment elsewhere. Thomas Brennan's trial had concluded in March with a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder, the jury accepting the defense argument that the shooting had occurred during a struggle rather than as a premeditated act. His sentence of 12 years' imprisonment had been received in Alderwick with the mixture of satisfaction and sadness that communities reserve for the fall of once respected citizens. Battle had given his testimony with the same careful objectivity he brought to all his professional duties, neither minimizing Brennan's culpability nor ignoring the desperate circumstances that had driven him to violence. The pier itself had been repaired and strengthened during the winter months. The local council had decided that the structure's association with tragedy should not be allowed to compromise its practical value to the community. Battle walked its length slowly, noting how the new planking gleamed pale against the weathered gray of the original construction. The spot where Edmund Castere had fallen was unmarked by any memorial, but Battle paused there nonetheless, remembering the fog-shrouded morning when he had first seen the scene. His contemplation was interrupted by footsteps behind him, and he turned to see Helena Castere approaching with the measured pace of someone taking her daily constitutional. She was dressed simply in a dark blue coat and walking shoes, her silver hair uncovered, and her manner carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had survived the worst that fate could offer. "Superintendent Battle," she said with genuine pleasure. "How unexpected to see you here. Are you visiting on official business?" "Nothing official, Mrs. Castere. I was in the area and thought I would look in on Alderwick. I trust you are well." "As well as can be expected, thank you." Her smile carried a serenity that had been absent during the dark days of the investigation. "I find that time has a way of providing perspective on even the most difficult circumstances." They walked together toward the harbor, their conversation touching on the changes that 6 months had brought to both their lives. Helena had sold the house on the hill and taken modest lodgings in the town center, using the proceeds to establish a small trust for the families of former shipyard workers who had struggled to find new employment. Her relationship with Major Ashford had ended quietly, both of them recognizing that their reunion had been built more on nostalgia than on genuine compatibility. "Charles has returned to his family," she explained without apparent regret. His wife had remarried, believing him dead, but his children were overjoyed to discover their father lived. It seemed wrong to deny them that happiness for the sake of my own feelings. David Castere had indeed found honest employment, securing a position with a shipping firm in Liverpool, where his education and family connections, while carrying the shadow of recent scandal, still held some value. His letters to his stepmother spoke of hard work and growing satisfaction with a life that depended on merit rather than expectation. "Visits when he can," Helena said. "The experience has matured him considerably. I think Edmund would have been proud of the man he is becoming." Dr. Weber continued his research along the coast, though he had moved his base of operations to a town where German accents attracted less suspicious attention. His scholarly work had gained recognition from the geological community, and Battle had read with interest a recent paper in which the scientist cited his observations at Alderwick as crucial to understanding coastal erosion patterns. As they reached the end of the pier, Helena paused to look out over the water that stretched endlessly toward France. "I sometimes wonder if Edmund might have found peace eventually if circumstances had been different. He was not a bad man, Superintendent, merely one who could not reconcile his dreams with reality. Few of us find that reconciliation easy, Battle replied. Your husband's tragedy was that his pride made compromise impossible, when compromise might have saved him. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the gulls wheel and cry above the harbor while fishing boats prepared for their morning departure. The scene was peaceful and timeless, unmarked by the human dramas that had played out against its backdrop. I should be returning, Helena said finally. I help with the church accounts on Wednesday mornings, and Mrs. Peterson becomes quite stern if I am late. Battle watched her walk back along the pier with the steady gait of someone who had found purpose in simple routine and honest service. The transformation from the nervous, guilt-ridden woman he had first interviewed to this calm figure suggested that redemption was possible, even after the most devastating revelations. Standing alone at the pier's end, Battle reflected on the lessons that the Alderwick case had taught him about the intricate connections between public appearances and private truths. The investigation had revealed how easily respectability could conceal desperation, how noble aspirations could mask fundamental self-deception, and how the fear of exposure could drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist and revealing the town in sharp, clear detail. Battle could see the church spire rising above the clustered rooftops, the narrow streets climbing away from the water, and the green hills that enclosed the harbor like protective arms. It was a scene of English tranquility that would grace any tourist postcard, unmarked by the passions and failures that had once threatened to destroy its peace. As he prepared to leave for what he suspected might be the final time, Battle carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served and wounds had begun to heal. The truth, however painful, had ultimately proven less destructive than the lies it had replaced, and the community had emerged stronger for having faced its shadows honestly. The train back to London would carry him toward new cases and fresh mysteries, but the quiet pier at Alderwick would remain in his memory as a reminder of both human frailty and human resilience, and of the complex dance between appearance and reality that defined so much of the world he had chosen to serve. Thanks for joining us for the mystery of Alderwick Pier. If you enjoyed this tale of human frailty with Superintendent Battle, don't forget to subscribe for more classic detective mysteries featuring Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, and other beloved detectives. Until next time, this is Ailey signing off from Cafe Tales.